A gripping story about insecurity, Fulani herdsmen, and the cry of forgotten communities. For years, the people of Umuchi village survived on the strength of their hands. Their farms were their pride, yam mounds rising like little hills, cassava stretching in neat rows, maize rustling under the sun. Every family depended on the soil. The land was their inheritance, their lifeline, their only hope in a country where hope itself was becoming scarce. But everything began to change the day the herdsmen arrived. They came from far in the north, slim men with long sticks, wrapped in faded jalabias, their cattle marching behind them like an army of hungry shadows. At first, the villagers tried to welcome them politely, believing they were only passing through. After all, Nigeria belonged to all of them, or so they thought. Soon, the cattle began wandering into farmlands, chewing tender crops like grass, trampling young plants under heavy hooves. A whole season of hard labor could disappear in a single afternoon. The farmers cried, the elders pleaded, the youths shouted, but the cattle kept coming. Every time the villagers complained, the herdsmen would shrug as if the crops meant nothing. Na animal go chop. And when the villagers protested further, the herdsmen would simply raise their voices or swing their sticks in warning. The tension grew, slow, hot, and poisonous. The farmers reported to the local government. They wrote letters. They went to the police station. They cried out to Abuja. But nobody listened. Nobody came. The village became invisible. To make matters worse, the herdsmen were no longer the gentle travelers people used to know. Some of them were heavily armed, carrying rifles instead of sticks, whispering to each other in low tones. Rumors spread like wildfire that some were not ordinary herdsmen, but hardened men who had crossed borders with weapons. The villagers became afraid to go to their own farms. One humid afternoon, Ezekiel, a middle-aged farmer, arrived at his farmland only to find it completely destroyed. His yams uprooted, his cassava chewed to the stump, his maize flattened into the mud. That was all he had. His wife was pregnant. His children depended on that harvest. Ezekiel fell on his knees and cried like a child. Around the village, the same story repeated. Women wept. Men clenched their fists. Children went hungry. Everyone felt powerless. Anger began to grow like a storm in the hearts of the youths. How can strangers come and destroy everything our fathers built? They shouted. Do we not have a government? Are we not Nigerians too? But the government remained silent, cold and distant. By the time the villagers realized the truth, it was too late. They were alone. Nobody was coming to help them. And so, the night the farms went silent, the entire village knew something was about to break. People began to sleep with one eye open. The air smelt of fear and dry dust. Everyone could feel it. The land was boiling, and one day it would explode. This is the story of a forgotten community, a land swallowed by insecurity, and a people pushed to the edge of survival, praying that one day justice will remember them. The small farming communities had tried everything they could to protect their land. They had appealed to local chiefs, written petitions to authorities, marched to the police station and the council offices, but nothing changed. Season after season, their seedlings and mounds disappeared beneath the heavy hooves of cattle driven from the north. The patience of the farmers finally snapped. In a desperate, dark decision, some farmers began to fight back with what they had. They mixed powerful pesticides and poisonous substances into piles of rejected crops and scattered them along the tracks where the herds were known to pass. Their intention was not mass slaughter at first. It was to warn the herders, to make them stop trampling the farms. They wanted their children to eat again. They wanted to teach respect for the land. But poison does not obey small intentions. When the cattle fed on the tainted fields, thousands dropped dead within days. The sight of bloated, fallen beasts in the trail, carcasses stacked like the ruins of a bad season, spread horror through both communities. The death of the cattle was an economic catastrophe for the herders, an immoral shock for the farmers who had expected only to scare the animals away. News spread fast, and anger grew faster. From the far north, men who kept the herds began to gather. Rumors said that wealthy patrons and politically connected figures, men with influence and resources, quietly sponsored the mobilization. Young Fulani men who had once moved quietly with their cattle now took up arms. They trained in secret camps, stockpiled weapons, and organized into units that would move swiftly and strike with surprise. Within months, the pattern changed from stray encroachment to organized violence. The armed herdsmen, now a militant force grown out of grief, rage, and patronage, spread across the country. They did not confine themselves to one region. Reports came in from many states. Caravans of mounted men disappearing into bushes near highways, ambushes on lonely travelers, women kidnapped from village compounds, and entire hamlets forced to flee under the moon. Where farms had once been safe, fear took root. People no longer walked the furrows at dawn. Markets became emptier. The roads that connected towns and villages grew dangerous. Drivers refused long routes. Mothers kept children close. Fathers slept with one eye open. The countryside turned into a landscape of suspicion and silence. The worst accusations were the hardest to silence. Locals claimed the attacks were not spontaneous, that certain powerful figures had provided money, guns, and political cover. When communities called for intervention, the response was slow, halting, or non-existent. The lack of a decisive, transparent response from authorities fed suspicions and fed the rage on both sides. Conspiracy and blame hardened into cycles of reprisals. As the violence deepened, the human toll multiplied. Families displaced, harvests lost, schools emptied, and entire local economies collapsing. Women reported being abducted and assaulted. Men were taken for ransom or killed. Travelers abandoned routes, traders stopped bringing goods, and some towns became effectively cut off. In the places hardest hit, people whispered that the country's leaders looked the other way, or worse, that they had a hand in what was happening. The result was a nation that began to fracture at its edges, a patchwork of terrified, grieving villages and emboldened armed bands. The farmers' initial act of desperation had triggered a spiral beyond anyone's control. What began as a tactic of survival turned into nationwide terror. And yet, beneath the headlines and the rumors, beneath the politics and recriminations, were the simple human tragedies. A mother who could no longer feed her children because she feared the field. A herdman whose life's work had been wiped out. A child who would never see school again because the road was not safe. The anger, the fear, the grief, these were the true currencies being spent not on political gain, but on survival. The story had no neat ending. In some towns, communities organized local defense groups. In others, people fled to cities and camps. Researchers and human rights organizations began documenting the events. Voices from civil society called for accountability and for investment in clear grazing routes, conflict mediation, and the rebuilding of trust between communities. But rebuilding trust after poison, after the death of cattle and the loss of lives, would take generations. This is the story of how an ecological and economic dispute, cattle, on farms, became a crisis of national security, and how the desperation of the small and the power of the connected can combine to create a cycle of violence. It is a story without easy answers, but with urgent lessons, that neglect breeds extremes, that fear can become organized, and that reconciliation requires both justice and practical policies that respect livelihoods on all sides.